Anakin was up working on the speeder long after he put Leia to bed. It wasn't that he was afraid to sleep anymore, his nightmares had long since stopped. He simply wasn't tired yet, but he could barely focus on what he was doing. He couldn't stop thinking about his and Padme's decision to cut off all communication with each other. That day when they had that scare with the Empire due to their devices being hacked, they had been panicked, barely able to think straight. They had been hasty in making such an important decision. Destroying the old comlinks had been the easy way, not the best way. The worst part was, many alternatives would have been available. Anakin probably could have found a way to secure his device's information, just like he did with the Z-95 headhunter. Or maybe they could have just used devices that weren't comms. Just about anything would have been better than never being able to speak to each other again. Now, they had no way to find each other if they did ever decide that they were no longer in danger from the Empire. Leia could never even hear her mother's voice, and Anakin could never know what his son was like. To ever find each other, in such a huge galaxy, without knowing each other's location, the odds were practically insurmountable. In his heart, Anakin wanted to believe that he would see Padme and Luke again. He wasn't sure he had ever accepted that they were probably gone for good. But it seemed as though sheer mathematical probability was screaming at him, "Your fate is sealed. You will never see your wife and son again." All of this was thanks to the Empire, and quite possibly the Jedi Order. His desires in life had always been simple, they revolved around people rather than pleasure or wealth or power. And yet, the few things he wanted had always been denied him. He had wanted his mother to be safe, but she died a cruel death. When he longed for respect from Obi-Wan and the other Jedi, they only watched him with a frowning, critical stare. And now, half of his family was gone. Anakin wondered if all this could have been avoided if his two mentors Palpatine and the Jedi hadn't turned on each other and forced him to take sides, and if the Empire had never been formed. What was the problem with the Republic, anyway? Had the Clone Wars left it too weak to salvage, or was there some bigger, more complex reason? These thoughts had him so preoccupied that he was forgetting all about his project. He just wanted to do something, challenge the Emperor, take down the Empire, destroy anything in his way. He watched a little rat scurry silently across the floor. Without really thinking about it, he seized the creature with the force and lifted it into the air, tightening his grip on its neck. The rat squirmed and writhed, its jaws agape as it tried to breathe. Its beady little eyes seemed to bulge out of its head. Somehow, it felt so good, so satisfying, to use the force without trying to stifle his emotions, to just let it all out. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Leia's voice, though barely above a whisper, could have been an explosion in the silent room. Anakin turned to her, startled. Her gaze fell on his clenched fist and the still choking rodent suspended in the air. The expression on her face was unreadable. "Please put it down," she whispered. He knew she was right. The rat, though a pest, did not deserve to be tormented by the Force this way. Slightly alarmed with himself for doing such a thing, he let the creature go. It was still alive, and it scampered away. Anakin was thankful he hadn't killed it. "Leia, I'm sorry," he mumbled, unsure of what else to say. Why did she have to come in when he was in one of his weaker moments? "What are you doing up?" he finally asked her. "I was thirsty. I got a drink, but I couldn't go back to sleep." "Why were you doing that?" "It's kind of a long story." "Are you sure you want to know?" "Yes." Leia pouted slightly, as if she were offended by the idea of not knowing the whole truth. Anakin sighed deeply and walked with her back into the house. "It's just I was angry. And you know that we're not supposed to get angry." Leia nodded and took a seat on the living room sofa. Anakin sat next to her. "I just couldn't stop thinking about the Empire and all the bad things they've done and how much I miss your mother and Luke. And all that anger had to come out somehow, and so I guess I had to use the Force on something." "But you're not allowed to kill things with the Force, right? That's what the Jedi say. If you use the Force to kill or hurt things, that's called the dark side." Leia's eyes widened as this new information clicked in her mind. "So the Force can be bad sometimes? Sort of. It has a light side and a dark side. The Jedi use the light side, but some people, like the Emperor, think the dark side is a good thing." "How come?" "Well, probably because you can use your emotions with the dark side. You don't have to hide fear or anger or hate. With the dark side, those feelings actually make you stronger." Anakin was up working on the speeder long after he put Leia to bed. It wasn't that he was afraid to sleep anymore, his nightmares had long since stopped. He simply wasn't tired yet, but he could barely focus on what he was doing. He couldn't stop thinking about his and Padme's decision to cut off all communication with each other. That day when they had that scare with the Empire due to their devices being hacked, they had been panicked, barely able to think straight. They had been hasty in making such an important decision. Destroying the old comlinks had been the easy way, not the best way. The worst part was, many alternatives would have been available. Anakin probably could have found a way to secure his device's information, just like he did with the Z-95 headhunter. Or maybe they could have just used devices that weren't comms. Just about anything would have been better than never being able to speak to each other again. Now, they had no way to find each other if they did ever decide that they were no longer in danger from the Empire. Leia could never even hear her mother's voice, and Anakin could never know what his son was like. To ever find each other in such a huge galaxy without knowing each other's location, the odds were practically insurmountable. In his heart, Anakin wanted to believe that he would see Padme and Luke again. He wasn't sure he had ever accepted that they were probably gone for good. But it seemed as though sheer mathematical probability was screaming at him, "Your fate is sealed. You will never see your wife and son again." All of this was thanks to the Empire and quite possibly the Jedi Order. His desires in life had always been simple, they revolved around people rather than pleasure or wealth or power. And yet, the few things he wanted had always been denied him. He had wanted his mother to be safe, but she died a cruel death. When he longed for respect from Obi-Wan and the other Jedi, they only watched him with a frowning, critical stare. And now, half of his family was gone. Anakin wondered if all this could have been avoided if his two mentors Palpatine and the Jedi hadn't turned on each other and forced him to take sides, and if the Empire had never been formed. What was the problem with the Republic, anyway? Had the Clone Wars left it too weak to salvage, or was there some bigger, more complex reason? These thoughts had him so preoccupied that he was forgetting all about his project. He just wanted to do something, challenge the Emperor, take down the Empire, destroy anything in his way. He watched a little rat scurry silently across the floor. Without really thinking about it, he seized the creature with the force and lifted it into the air, tightening his grip on its neck. The rat squirmed and writhed, its jaws agape as it tried to breathe. Its beady little eyes seemed to bulge out of its head. Somehow, it felt so good, so satisfying, to use the force without trying to stifle his emotions, to just let it all out. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Leia's voice, though barely above a whisper, could have been an explosion in the silent room. Anakin turned to her, startled. Her gaze fell on his clenched fist and the still choking rodent suspended in the air. The expression on her face was unreadable. "Please put it down," she whispered. He knew she was right. The rat, though a pest, did not deserve to be tormented by the Force this way. Slightly alarmed with himself for doing such a thing, he let the creature go. It was still alive, and it scampered away. Anakin was thankful he hadn't killed it. "Leia, I'm sorry," he mumbled, unsure of what else to say. Why did she have to come in when he was in one of his weaker moments? "What are you doing up?" he finally asked her. "I was thirsty. I got a drink, but I couldn't go back to sleep." "Why were you doing that?" "It's kind of a long story." "Are you sure you want to know?" "Yes." Leia pouted slightly, as if she were offended by the idea of not knowing the whole truth. Anakin sighed deeply and walked with her back into the house. "It's just I was angry. And you know that we're not supposed to get angry." Leia nodded and took a seat on the living room sofa. Anakin sat next to her. "I just couldn't stop thinking about the Empire and all the bad things they've done and how much I miss your mother and Luke. And all that anger had to come out somehow, and so I guess I had to use the Force on something." "But you're not allowed to kill things with the Force, right? That's what the Jedi say. If you use the Force to kill or hurt things, that's called the dark side." Leia's eyes widened as this new information clicked in her mind. "So the Force can be bad sometimes? Sort of. It has a light side and a dark side. The Jedi use the light side, but some people, like the Emperor, think the dark side is a good thing." "How come?" "Well, probably because you can use your emotions with the dark side. You don't have to hide fear or anger or hate. With the dark side, those feelings actually make you stronger. So, with the light side, do you have to be really happy and really brave?" Anakin smiled slightly at Leia's rationalization. Bravery and happiness, in her mind, were probably the literal opposites of fear and anger. If only it was all that simple. "Not quite," he said. "The Jedi want you to use no emotion. No happiness, no sadness, no hate, no love. Only peace and calmness. But that's hard. It's hard to be calm sometimes." "That doesn't make sense." Leia scowled, deep in thought. "If you don't use your emotions, you're not very powerful, are you?" "True, but the Jedi aren't about power. The Sith are. But if they're not powerful, how do they beat the bad guys?" Anakin laughed softly. "That's a very good point. I guess that's why we used to have hundreds of Jedi and only 2 Sith. But some Jedi, like Yoda and Mace Windu, were very powerful. Then they're not being very good Jedi if Jedi don't want to be powerful. By Leah's logic, Yoda and Windu were the worst Jedi. But they were supposed to be the best, and Anakin realized he didn't fully understand why. The Jedi make no sense, Leah went on. I'm glad I'm not one. But Leah did have a small amount of force sensitivity. Anakin had seen her talk about how she knew what some people were feeling, even when they weren't around. If she really wanted to, Leah could probably be a Jedi. I think it's time for us both to go to bed, Anakin told her. But maybe someday, you'll invent a better way to use the Force. Anakin didn't know if the Jedi were right or the Sith were right. Whether he used the light side or the dark side of the Force, it somehow felt wrong. Surely, the Force didn't exist just so Jedi and Sith could mold it into their own creations, did it? By the time they got back, Padme had almost completely forgotten about her obligation to meet with Bail and Mon that evening. The incident with the stormtroopers had caused her to lose all track of time, and now she realized that she had about 10 minutes until the meeting, and she still needed to report the incident and figure out what to do with Luke. School was done for the day, and he certainly wouldn't appreciate being dragged into the meeting. Luke, she said, how would you like to help out the mechanics for a while? He glanced up at her and narrowed his eyes, probably sensing that she was up to something. Why? He inquired. I have a very long grown-up meeting. You wouldn't like it, I don't think, but learning about ships will be fun, right? Luke sighed and stared blankly off into the distance. Please, Luke, Padme thought, I don't have time to argue with you about this. But, he said softly, I want to stay with you, Mommy. If she weren't in such a hurry, her heart would have melted at his sweet words. I would want to stay with you too, but if you come with me, you'll have to sit still and be quiet for up to 2 hours. Luke gave no response. Padme figured he didn't really understand what a 2-hour meeting would be like, so she decided it was best just to make the decision for him. Surely he would love being in the hangar, he would thank her later. Fortunately, one of the mechanics, a young Twi'lek woman, was gracious enough to accept a little helper for a while, so Padme dropped Luke off there and hurried to the security office. The security guards monitoring their computers glanced up in concern when Padme burst in. General Amidala, is everything all right? One of them asked her. She had never been able to get used to being called General Amidala, especially when her title should have been General Skywalker. But General Skywalker was supposed to be Anakin. I have an incident to report, she said, breaking out of her reverie. I saw some stormtroopers when I was out in the town with my son, and I wanted the security team to be aware. When did you see the troops? Did they notice you? Padme explained the rest of the story, but left out the part in which Luke accidentally used the Force. She watched the security guard's face as she related the story, and while he didn't say anything, his brow creased in concern, and his frown deepened. Are you sure they didn't follow you back here? He said sternly when she was done. I can't be too sure. I was constantly checking my rearview mirrors on the way back, and I didn't see anyone, but it's possible that they were clever enough to not be seen. I never thought the Empire would get close to this planet so quickly, he murmured, half to himself. Thanks for the report, General. I'll have the team keep an eye on the radar scanner. Thank you, she breathed, and hurried off to the meeting. She was already late, but Bail and Mon would understand. Padme found the two of them staring intensely at the computer screen, and they barely seemed to notice her tardiness. Padme, Mon said, come look at this. We just received a notification from the security office that there was stormtrooper activity in the area. I know, I was there, she muttered, taking a seat next to Bail. As he and Mon stared at her in surprise, she told them the whole story, including Luke's impulsive use of the Force. She could trust Bail and Mon to keep this information private. Let me get this straight, Mon said. Luke used the Force in public and shattered a window in front of stormtroopers. He didn't mean to, Padme retorted. I don't think he can control it much yet. Children require years of training to learn to use the Force properly, Bail said, coming to Padme's defense. And all the Jedi are dead or hiding, so there's no one left to train Luke. I understand, and I'm not blaming him. Mon sighed and ran her fingers through her auburn hair. But you realize what serious implications this has, don't you? I'm just concerned that Luke cannot be controlled in this way, and that we may experience more problems like this in the future. Padme nodded. The truth stung, but she couldn't disagree with Mon's reasoning. I wish I knew how to help him, she murmured. It's just he has so much of his father in him. They all fell silent. Mon stared at the ground, while Bail smiled sympathetically. Well, we can't worry about this now, Mon said. We have a battle to plan. Better do it quickly, before the Empire figures out that we're here. She opened up some software that had an interactive map showing where the Empire's new outpost was. The next hour or so was spent discussing ways to stealthily enter the outpost before attacking it and where were the most strategic places to have ground soldiers and air forces. A few times they brought in some people, such as the lead pilot and the head of security, to give their input. Padme felt confident throughout the whole discussion because she was well versed in the subject of military strategy thanks to her experiences in the Clone Wars. Even better, the battle plan they ended up creating seemed like a good one. If all went well, the stealth team would be able to disable the outpost's power generators and put the stormtroopers there into a state of confusion before the attack. That would give everyone else a chance to sneak in and surround the outpost and hopefully take it down swiftly and decisively. Bail, Mon and Padme decided not to take any prisoners because there was the possibility that they would escape and reveal the location of the rebel base. The only thing Padme was dreading was the idea that she might have to take a life. Just as they were finalizing the details, a knock sounded on the door. "Come in," Padme said. The door hissed open, and the Twi'lek mechanic came in with Luke, smiling sheepishly. "I am so sorry to interrupt, generals." Padme blinked in surprise. Luke was staring at the ground, not meeting her gaze. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Well," the Twi'lek laughed nervously. "I'm really sorry, but I do need to return your son to you. It's just that he's been distracted. Wandering off, getting into things he's not supposed to, and not following directions. You don't mind having him back here, do you?" "No, of course not. I'm sorry he gave you trouble." The Twi'lek smiled awkwardly and hurried out, probably embarrassed by the whole situation. "Am I in trouble, Mommy?" Luke whimpered, while Padme had him take a seat. "We'll talk about this later, Luke." Padme didn't intend to punish him, since his misbehavior was largely caused by his personality, and so it was mostly outside his control. But he definitely needed a good talking to. Bail and Mon were polite and gave no reaction, and once Luke was quiet, the discussion resumed. They soon ended the meeting feeling apprehensive, but well prepared. As Padme was taking Luke back to their quarters, Bail came running up and caught up with them. "Padme," he said, "I feel terrible about the incident in the town today because it's mostly my fault. If I hadn't suggested you go out with Luke today." Padme tried to suppress a laugh. "Oh, Bail, it's not your fault. In fact, I'm glad we saw the stormtroopers because everyone's aware of it now. So, really, I ought to be thanking you." Still, when I think about what could have happened, he shook his head in dismay. "If anything had happened to you, Padme, I could never forgive myself." His voice was quiet and serious. Padme was a bit taken aback by the sincerity of his words. "Is there anything I can do to make it up to you?" Bail asked. Really, there was no reason why he had to make up to her at all, but Padme could see that he needed her to say something that would help him ease his guilt, even if that guilt was misplaced. So she smiled and said, "Keep doing what you've been doing and help us win this battle." Plus, she was glad to know that there would always be at least one person looking out for her and Luke in the rebel base. Bail Organa, she couldn't help thinking, would be an excellent father. As Anakin had suspected, Leia was groggy and tired when she woke up the next morning. "I'm never staying up late again," she grumbled as she dragged to get ready for the day. She had learned the lesson for herself, which was all that Anakin had wanted. This little experience would motivate Leia to go to bed early, much more than it would have if it was nothing more than Anakin telling her what to do. Soon, they were in the speeder and on the way to school. Even though Leia was tired, she seemed to be growing more and more alert as they drove. "Is something wrong?" Anakin asked her, noticing her fidgeting and uneasiness. "I don't want to go to school today," she said bluntly. "Why not?" "I don't know. I just don't." "Are you worried about those bully kids who were teasing you yesterday?" "I don't know. Maybe." Her voice was nonchalant, as if the bully kids were actually the last thing on her mind. Anakin wondered if Leia was feeling some disturbance in the Force that he was not aware of. Children did have a tendency to be even more sensitive to the Force than highly trained adults because their potential was so raw, so new. Anyone else might have dismissed Leia's remarks as nothing more than a little girl feeling grumpy and sleep-deprived, but Anakin did not take them lightly. "Just remember this," he told her. "If anyone ever tries to hurt you, either by saying mean things or by pushing you around or anything like that, fight back. Argue, push them back, stomp your feet, yell. Bullies never expect people to fight back. And if someone is too strong for you to face on your own, get help. Get a teacher or contact me. Does that make sense?" Leia nodded. She stared off into the distance, deep in thought. They soon reached the school, and Anakin parked the speeder and got out to walk Leia up to the entrance. Her earlier grogginess seemed to return. She dragged her feet and walked slowly. When they got to the front door, she stopped altogether. Anakin was about to urge Leia to go in, but then she turned around and hugged him tightly. "Daddy," she whispered, "I really don't want to go. Can I just skip school today and go to work with you? Please?" She stared up at him, her big brown eyes anxious and pleading. Slightly alarmed by Leia's urgency, Anakin knelt down so that he could be at eye level with her. "It will be all right," he reassured her. "Work is only 5 minutes away from here. I can come and get you if something happens. You have your comlink, right?" She nodded and frowned slightly. "But why are you making me go? I just don't want you to get in trouble after yesterday's incident. And I promise, I will come and get you if you contact me. But I want you to be a big girl and at least try, okay?" "Okay," she sighed and reluctantly walked away. "Bye. Bye," he said. There was something about her sudden anxiety and clinginess that bothered him. She wasn't normally like this. He made a mental note to come back in a few hours and check on her, just in case. It wasn't until a while later, when he had been working in the shop for a half hour or so, when he finally felt it. A disturbance in the force, one that reeked of the dark side. He shuddered slightly. Leia had felt it long before he had. Anakin suddenly wished he had listened to her and not sent her to school at all. She had no business being remotely involved with any sort of dark side activity. It was bad enough that she had seen him use the force choke. If the dark side really was here, there was no time to waste. He closed the hood of the speeder and drove off, not caring that he wasn't technically allowed to drive it at this time. Just after he turned onto the street, his comlink vibrated. He snatched it and recognized Leia's number on the ID screen. Heart pounding with dread, he answered, "Leia, what's wrong?" He listened tensely. Nothing was to be heard except sounds of scuffle and people clamoring in the background. Leia was breathing heavily, and the sounds of her breathing grew softer and louder at random times, as if she were trying to hold the comm close to her mouth, but was being restrained. "Help," her voice came out choppy, more scuffling. "Help me, hey." Leia's voice was cut off by that of an adult. "I'll take that." The voice sounded like it was behind a helmet. The only people who commonly wore helmets were stormtroopers. Then, the call was disconnected. Anakin drove like he had never driven before, and that was saying something. He pushed the speeder to its maximum speed, breaking the law into pieces. But it worked. He arrived at the school 2 minutes later. Everyone had evacuated the school and was standing outside, and a large group of stormtroopers was surrounding everyone and pointing blasters at them. The children were crying and the teachers were yelling, and the stormtroopers kept shouting, "There's been an emergency, but it's under control." Anakin parked the speeder and anxiously scanned the crowd for Leia. But he didn't sense that she was there. However, the force seemed to be directing his attention to the Imperial gunships that had landed nearby. As he watched the sight, he spotted the white armor of 2 stormtroopers dragging a little dark-haired girl. Anakin couldn't see them too well, being too far away, but he knew that the girl was Leia. He was probably the only person who saw this. Everyone else was distracted. Without really stopping to think about it, Anakin jumped out of the speeder and dashed after the stormtroopers. He concentrated on the force in order to move faster. As he ran, the stormtroopers got closer and closer to their ship. Its ramp opened, and they disappeared inside before Anakin could get remotely close. A deafening roar blasted through the air as the gunship's jets were fired up, and it lifted off. Years of GD training had taught Anakin to always keep 3 things: lightsaber, comm, and tracking device. After all this time, the habit had not died, and now he was thankful for that. After glancing around to make sure that no one was watching, he threw a tracking device at the ship's hull. Then, the ship took off into the atmosphere and disappeared. Leia was gone along with it. "No," he whispered, as if the simple word would turn the ship around and bring her back. At this point, there was only one thing left to do. He had to go after her. Anakin ran back to the speeder and jumped in and drove off towards his house, knowing that he would have to get R2 out of there. This was partly because he would need the droid's help to navigate, and partly because he was aware that they might not ever come back to this house. R2 beeped anxiously when Anakin burst in. "R2, get in the speeder," he said hurriedly. "We need to get out of here." The droid obeyed, beeping frantically the whole time. Anakin understood some of the astromech language and knew that R2 was saying, "Why? What happened? Where are we going? Where is Leia?" No time to explain, but it's bad. Really bad. Once R2 had used his jets to lift himself into the speeder, Anakin drove off towards the shop, where he kept his old Z-95 headhunter. "Skywalker," his boss said irritably as he rushed in. "That speeder is not for your personal use, and you didn't report when you left." "Sorry, I don't have time to explain." Anakin pulled off the ship's cloth cover and fired up the engine. He ignored his boss's disapproving frown, knowing that it was unlikely he would ever return to this place. R2 rolled into the ship and Anakin lifted it off. As they gained altitude, they spotted a swarm of stormtroopers gathered around a house. They looked like shiny white beetles devouring their prey. Anakin realized that the stormtroopers were surrounding his house. R2 gave an alarmed beep. "What is going on?" the little droid demanded. R2 they took her. Leia. For once, R2 was silent. Anakin took the counterpart to the tracking device and connected it to the ship's dashboard. A plotted course showed up on the screen, one that led straight to Coruscant. Coruscant, the belly of the beast, the throne of the Empire. "And look where they're taking her," he mumbled. The very thought of returning to that planet, after all that had happened, was sickening. The thought of Leia being all alone with the Empire there was even worse. Plus, R2 gave a few quiet beeps that translated to, "I will help you find her." Anakin tried to smile at his faithful little droid. While he was thankful to not technically be alone in this quest, he understood the odds. It was the two of them against a whole empire now. These past 7 years had brought nothing but unsatisfied desire to the apprentice of Darth Sidious. While the title of apprentice was an honor, she knew it was nothing more than that. Just a title, a name with no meaning. Lord Sidious had given her an opportunity all those years ago, just one task, and she had failed. Apparently that failure had told him a lot, because he had never entrusted her with anything else. Sidious was like a parent who favored one child over the other, and his apprentice knew which of those children she was. The Emperor only wanted what he couldn't have. "Skywalker. Why do you need him so badly?" the apprentice wanted to say. "Yes, he is powerful, but he has been hiding for 7 years. We have heard nothing from him. Meanwhile, here I am, willing to learn and obey." It wasn't her fault that she wasn't destined to bring balance to the Force. She had the eager and humble spirit of an apprentice, while Skywalker did not. She couldn't even remember the last time Sidious had contacted her to ask for anything. So, for a long time, she had wandered aimlessly throughout the Outer Rim, somehow hoping to find Skywalker. She had long since figured out that she could never be what Sidious wanted, but if she did find Skywalker, could she earn a small trace of favor in the Emperor's eyes? Many times, the apprentice felt disgusted with herself for carrying on this way. She was practically a slave, a dog who pathetically yapped after its master's heels. But she felt that she had nothing else to do with her life. Nothing else was worthwhile or meaningful. Why did her destiny depend solely on Darth Sidious? Why was he the only one who could help her? As she stood on a high cliff, thinking about all this, she took out her lightsaber and fingered it. She had made this herself years ago, when she was a teenage Padawan in the Jedi Order. Back then, she had been unbelievably excited to finally have a weapon of her own, but now when she looked at it, all she could see was its faults. The poor craftsmanship, the unbalanced design, and the blue blade that represented everything that she was not. Blue was supposed to represent peace and contentment, an unattainable ideal for her. She wished she could destroy the useless thing, but that was almost impossible. Someone might find it and try to rebuild it. At this point, she didn't even know if the Force was worth caring about anymore. She could feel it, but only just enough that she could clearly see how far she was from understanding it. It would give her certain feelings that would later prove meaningless. She would try to let it guide her, but it would lead her nowhere. The Force seemed like it was toying with her, amused by her. The apprentice figured that if the Force would only cooperate with her, and if she could learn to use it properly, then she wouldn't have so many problems. She might actually feel like she had a purpose. But the only person who could teach her was Sidious. At least, that was what she assumed, but she had to wonder if it was true. After all, she did recall that no person had ever helped her achieve a breakthrough in the days of her Jedi training. Her greatest breakthroughs had always been self-taught. The apprentice also realized that her connection to the Force had been weakened after the day she assisted Sidious in the Great Jedi Purge. Her emotions had been out of control that day, and she had hated what she was doing. The Force had been filled with horror and death. Maybe she had simply been too scared to tap deeply into the Force after that point. As the wind blew precariously around her, she realized something. Sidious would not ever care enough to help her, she would have to help herself. She got into her ship and set a course for Ilum, where she planned to build herself a new lightsaber, a symbol of a new life, in which she would never be a slave to Darth Sidious. Due to the ship not having enough fuel to make it all the way to Coruscant, Anakin was forced to pull the ship out of hyperspace early. They came to a planet called Jubilar, a desert planet in the Outer Rim. Anakin was glad that they wouldn't have to actually land on this dust ball, because there was a fueling station on an asteroid nearby. Plus, of course, the delay made him impatient. This was a half hour that he could have spent looking for Leia, but instead he had to refuel the ship. What a waste of precious time. Even worse, the fuel station was crowded. There was a long line to get onto the asteroid. Anakin would have liked to go back into hyperspace and stop at a different planet, but the ship probably didn't have enough fuel for that. He should have been thinking about this earlier, but planning had never been his strong point, and he had been slightly distracted with the small detail that his daughter had been captured by the Empire. R2 seemed to be sharing Anakin's thoughts exactly. He gave a sharp, agitated beep when he observed the long line. "I know, it's annoying." Anakin sighed and steered the ship towards the line. "But we have no choice." Just as he was about to join the line, the roar of jets sounded and the large ship sped by, right in front of him, cutting him off. The large ship's wing was just a few feet shy of hitting his windshield. Anakin muttered a Huttese curse under his breath. "What does that guy think he's doing?" he exclaimed, quickly turning the ship around. There was now a considerable distance between his ship and the line, and now the enemy kept spinning around him, forcing him to move farther and farther from the line. "R2, Anakin said, get the laser cannons ready, just in case." What was this guy's problem, anyway? Was he really that desperate to cut people off? Was there a fuel shortage in this system? Whatever the reason, Anakin did not have time to put up with the other pilot's aggressive rudeness. But the other pilot reacted first and used his own machine guns to fire at Anakin's ship. "R2, look at this guy," Anakin muttered in amazement, swerving the ship to dodge the fire and shooting back. He wished this Z-95 headhunter was more maneuverable. The controls felt stiff compared to the nimble GD starfighters of the Clone Wars. The enemy's ship was obviously of a much higher quality than the Z-95, and it easily dodged all of Anakin's blasts and returned fire at a rapid pace. Anakin figured that this pilot was not concerned with the fueling station. He was behaving far too aggressively for that to be plausible. So, who was he, and what was his motive? Anakin realized that the ship looked familiar. He felt that he had seen it before. Then it hit him. This was Jango Fett's ship, the Slave Eye. But Jango Fett is dead, he thought. Who got his ship after he was killed? There was no time to wonder about this, though. It took every ounce of his concentration to anticipate the blasts far enough in advance to give the ship enough time to move out of the way. It had an annoyingly slow response time. Anakin just wished that he had a better ship, because he was sure that he was a better pilot than the stranger. This was not a fair fight. Then, there was a tumultuous crashing noise, and Anakin's controls flashed angrily. He watched in dismay as a large chunk of metal flew by outside a remnant of one of the wings. The ship started to spiral out of control. "R2, we have to try to land on the planet," Anakin said through clenched teeth. "Otherwise, we'll break out of the planet's gravitational pull and spiral infinitely into space." But the steering controls were practically useless with the wing being blasted off. The enemy pilot kept shooting while Anakin struggled with his controls, but, miraculously, the other pilot kept missing. Finally, he managed to steer the ship onto a course that headed straight down to the planet's surface. Once they broke into the atmosphere, the ship became slightly easier to steer, but it was accelerating at an uncontrollable rate. The ship hit a rough patch of air and shook unpleasantly. The enemy pilot continued to pursue them. R2 gave a nervous beep as the ship's turbulence grew increasingly worse. "I know," Anakin sighed. "This is going to be a rough landing." He realized that now they were taking a nosedive towards the planet's surface, and the landing would be quite dangerous. "R2, prepare to eject from the ship," he said, unstrapping himself from the pilot's chair and opening some of the doors. They had no parachute, but Anakin knew that the Force would help with their timing. They hurried up to the door and jumped out just as the ship was about to touch the ground. Anakin used the Force to ease R2's landing as well as his own, and a deafening roar sounded as the ship crashed. Smoke and debris flew everywhere, and Anakin ducked in order to avoid it. They had landed in the middle of nowhere, so no civilians were harmed by the crash. Then, the enemy ship landed and its cockpit opened. From it emerged a man who was completely covered in green Mandalorian armor, which was unnervingly similar to Jango Fett's. He activated a jetpack attached to his back, flew up into the air, and pulled out a large machine gun. Anakin realized he had no choice but to use his lightsaber. He reached into a hidden pocket and activated his blue blade for the first time in several years. The enemy warrior, who seemed to be a bounty hunter, fired off a series of laser blasts from his gun. Anakin deflected the blasts almost unconsciously. He found it amazing that, even though he hadn't used a lightsaber in such a long time, he had not forgotten how to do it. His reflexes practically did all the work for him, bouncing the blasts directly back at their source. The bounty hunter seemed to realize that his blasts were doing him more harm than good because Anakin kept deflecting them right at him. Without a word, the warrior reached into his utility belt and pulled out a thermal detonator. R2, watch out! Anakin shouted, even though he wasn't sure where the little droid was. The bounty hunter threw the detonator, and Anakin just barely had enough time to dive behind the cover of his crashed ship. Another ear-splitting roar pierced the air. The ground and everything else shook violently. A blinding flash of fire ignited for an instant and then disappeared. For such a small object, that detonator had produced quite a large explosion. The sound eventually died down. Anakin crept out from behind the remains of his ship, with his ears ringing from the violent sound and his lungs burning from the thick smoke. As the smoke cleared, it became evident that the bounty hunter and his ship were gone. There was no sign of R2 either. R2? Anakin called anxiously, hoping his droid had survived the explosion. To his relief, a faint beep sounded in the distance. R2 turned out to be hidden in a clump of dry-looking desert plants and, despite being covered in dust, seemed to be undamaged. There you are you okay? Anakin wiped the dust off R2's eye, and the droid gave an affirmative beep. Good, because the ship's not. Anakin glanced sadly at the smoking heap of scrap metal. He had put so much work into that ship, it was a shame it was ruined. The worst part was the fact that they had lost so much time while fighting the bounty hunter. Now, they were stranded in the middle of nowhere on a desert planet of all places, and they had no supplies. The Empire was probably a whole day ahead of them now. Leia would have to suffer through that many more hours of being scared and trapped and alone. The day before the planned attack was nothing but monotonous tasks like inspecting weapons and distributing supplies. Tedious, relatively unimportant work. Padme had never enjoyed this sort of activity, but right now, it was necessary. Besides, it was distracting her from having to think about tomorrow's battle. After several hours of running around the base and making lists and hauling boxes around, everyone agreed that they were as well prepared as they possibly could be. Relieved to be done, Padme hurried off to get Luke. Judging by the looks on the daycare workers' faces as Padme came in, she could tell that something was wrong. They all had that same anxious, embarrassed look that the Twi'lek mechanic had yesterday when Luke was misbehaving. Is everything all right? Padme asked. She glanced around for Luke, but he was nowhere to be seen. One of the workers walked up closer to Padme, glanced around, and lowered her voice. I'm so sorry about this, but your son got into a fight with another student today. Padme blinked in surprise. This was so unlike Luke. Did he really? I'm afraid so. Well, thank you for telling me. I'll have a word with him. Padme sighed and went to find Luke, who had been banished to sit alone in a corner. If only those workers knew that sitting alone was hardly a punishment for Luke. He didn't meet her eyes or say a word as they went to dinner. So, Padme said coolly, are you going to tell me what happened? He simply shrugged. Who did you fight with? I don't know his name. Why did you fight him? I was trying to help a girl with her project because she was alone and I wanted to be nice like what you said. And then a boy noticed, and he teased us, and he pushed me, so I pushed him back, and he didn't stop so I didn't stop either. Padme frowned slightly, annoyed that the one time Luke had taken her advice, it had turned out badly for him. Did he apologize? No. Did you apologize? No. He's the one who started it. Maybe tomorrow, you should try to make up to him. Say, I'm sorry I pushed you, but I don't want you to tease me again. That might help. It won't, Luke said bluntly. Padme shook her head. This was one lesson he would have to learn on his own. Luke, she said, kneeling down to be at eye level with him, please understand something. I can't take you with me to the battle tomorrow. It's far too dangerous. You know that, right? He nodded glumly. So while I'm gone, you have to be good for your teachers. It's okay to play by yourself. Just don't get into fights with anyone. Be on your best behavior. And I'll come back soon, and I'll talk to you on the comm while I'm gone. Understood? But do you have to go, Mommy? Luke's blue eyes were white and anxious. He clearly understood what a battle meant. Yes. But it's a good thing, because we're going to tell the Empire to stay away. And I promise, I will come back soon. Padme smiled and gave Luke a hug. I love you, Luke. I love you too. Every second, Padme was longing more and more for the battle to be over. She might not have to be directly fighting very much, but it would be dangerous no matter what. It was hard to face the idea that one small mistake could separate her from Luke forever. The next morning, the vast majority of the rebels all boarded gunships and X-wings and Y-wings and took off for the new Imperial outpost. Padme felt queasy with nervousness, and she was sure everyone else did too. This was the first time she had been in a real battle since the Battle of Geonosis, back in the beginning of the Clone Wars. She, along with Bail and Mon and some other officers, used a private shuttle from which they would direct the troops. The first task after landing on the planet was to land a few miles away from the outpost and wait for a group of Imperial gunships to arrive. After a few hours, an Imperial fleet registered on their scanner. Padme said on the comm to the lead pilot, "Red 1, go ahead." At her word, the pilot took off and joined the Imperial fighters, as if he were one of them. After that, it was more waiting, because the pilot's next job was to sneak into the hangar, enter the outpost, and disable the power generators. The plan was for this maneuver to be swift, stealthy and efficient. It felt like an eternity before the lead pilot contacted them again. When he spoke, commotion sounded all around, and he seemed to be out of breath. "I disabled the generators," he gasped, "but they know I'm here, and they're banging on the door, trying to get in. You need to take the troops in now, I don't have much time." Mon, frowning, picked up the comm and responded, "We'll do that. Hold them off as long as you can." She glanced anxiously at Bail and Padme. They were all thinking the same thing. They had lost their key advantage, the element of surprise. So the three of them sent out the troops and ran to join the battle. Padme drew her blaster pistol from its holster, feeling sick with dread. As all the rebel troops emerged and the ships flew into view, the stormtroopers came out of their outpost with blasters ready. Padme's heart sank. The stormtroopers weren't supposed to have anticipated the attack. But it was too late to turn back. Bail gave the order to open fire. And then chaos erupted everywhere. The rebels rushed forward, blasting at the stormtroopers, who returned fire. High-pitched noises from the weapons and smoke from the blasts filled the air. Padme forced herself to be aware of all the directions the blasts came from, so she could dodge the ones that came her way. Some people around her screamed. She turned and spotted some fallen bodies, with gaping wounds in their heads or torsos. With a shudder, she tore her gaze away and kept running. It soon became hard to see or hear anything, but Padme could tell that a couple of stormtroopers had fallen already, and some of the rebels had entered the outpost. But they were being chased by the occupants inside. The rest was just madness, raw desire to survive. All Padme could see was the red and green laser blasts, and the helmets of the stormtroopers, and some of the other rebels scrambling for cover. Her pulse pounded in her ears. There was no strategy to this fight anymore. The carefully created plans were so far from her mind now. Dodge the blasts, stay alive, were her only thoughts. Aim for their necks. Get home to Luke. One time, Padme managed to fell a stormtrooper with one of her blasts. But as his body crumpled to the ground, she didn't feel proud or triumphant. A person who had been alive just a few short minutes ago was now dead, thanks to her. She wondered if there could have been another way, a better way, to handle this. By now, a good half of the rebel forces had entered the outpost, but that wasn't good enough. They were heavily outnumbered by the stormtroopers inside. Padme's comlink vibrated. She barely took any notice at first, but at the last second she remembered that it might be important, so she ducked behind cover and answered. "Padme," said Mon from the other end, "we have to retreat. They're sending in reinforcements. We can't win." Her mind barely processed this. The news simply made her feel numb. "We can leave now," was her only thought. "This is over." It was a relief, really. Sad, but a relief. "All right," she said simply. Then she stood up and screamed over the noise, "Retreat." At first, no one seemed to hear her, but then some other rebels started to shout the word, and everyone ran towards the exit. And of course, the stormtroopers chased them. All the rebels had to keep glancing backwards in order to dodge the blasts. It wasn't much better outside. Fallen bodies were everywhere. The area stank of burning flesh, of blast wounds. Smoke drifted off the bodies. Padme was so preoccupied with watching the stormtroopers behind her that she wasn't looking where she was going, and she tripped on something. A body. The lead pilot's body. She just stared at it for a minute. His eyes were lifelessly open, his mouth agape in an unfinished scream. His skin had become pale and clammy. He barely looked like the pilot who had been alive just a half hour ago. Someone pulled Padme to her feet. She forced her shaky legs to keep moving. She and several others entered the gunships and took off. It was only a fraction of the number that had originally come. Maybe some rebels had been left behind in the chaos below, left to be killed or captured. Padme was too shocked to say a word or cry or do anything else. This battle had been far from a victory, not at all what she had imagined. All it had been was the rebels foolishly throwing themselves into danger and barely escaping with their lives. Anakin spent the next hour hacking his way into the remains of the ship, hoping to find his holomup. Without it, there was pretty much no way to figure out how to get back into civilization. He still felt uneasy using his lightsaber out in the open, even though no one except R2 was around to see it. But it was the only way to enter the crumpled ship. To his relief, the holomup was still in the cockpit of the ship and mostly undamaged, except for a couple of minor dents and loose wires. Once the wires were fixed, Anakin plugged the device into R2, who helped calculate where the nearest town was. Thankfully, there was one about 5 miles away. With one last glance at the ruined ship, Anakin and R2 headed off to the town. Every second, Anakin was reminded of how much he hated desert planets. This place was not as bad as Tatooine, because it only had one sun, but it was still hot and sandy and dry. The whole land was parched, begging for one drop of water, and the plants were limited to leafless, shriveled, scrubby bushes. The heat was nauseating. Nothing was tall enough to provide shade from the scorching sun. On top of all that, Anakin was wearing dark clothes. He felt like a magnet that was attracting the desert's wrath. It took them at least an hour, probably more, to get to the town. Then, the next task was to buy some overpriced water from one of the shops. That was an annoying way to spend hard-earned money, but there was no other way to get water out here. You're lucky that the desert can't suck your fuel right out of you, R2, Anakin muttered. The droid beeped in agreement. Then they had to buy a ship. The choices were limited because Jubilar wasn't exactly a thriving trade center, and Anakin did not want to spend his remaining money on another ship. The one he ended up buying was small and junky, and it barely worked. It needed several repairs before it could be rendered flyable. So he rented a space and some tools, just as he had done 7 years ago when he and Padme were trying to get off of Coruscant. Back then, neither of them had any idea what direction their lives would take. He was forced to cut off the thought before it could get too overwhelming. Thankfully, the task of repairing the ship was challenging enough to help him take his mind off these ideas. The main jets had to be completely taken apart because they were the main problem with the ship. Their internal parts were covered in dust. This ship had obviously not been used in a while. He had been feverishly working for a long time, trying to hurry the process along, when a voice startled him. "So, you know a thing or two about ships, huh?" Anakin glanced up to see a teenager standing there at the door, with disheveled clothes and a cocky smirk. He was probably about 15 or 16. "You could say that," Anakin said coolly, trying to decide whether or not the kid looked trustworthy. "Why?" The boy shrugged and pushed a lock of greasy brown hair away from his face. "Well, I know some things about ships too. Maybe I could help you fix that piece of junk?" Anakin couldn't deny that the ship was hardly worth more than scrap metal, but his suspicions of the kid kept growing. "I know there's a catch. What would you get out of it? You want me to hire you? I don't have a ton of money. Obviously." The boy's smirk widened. "But I don't even have a ship, and I don't need much money. I need to get off this blasted planet. Well, I'm not going to be your chauffeur. I'll only take you if it's convenient. Where are you trying to go?" "Coruscant." Anakin blinked in surprise. "Really? Why? None of your business. Will you take me there if I help you fix the ship?" A little bit of help might be useful, and the boy did want to go to Coruscant. This would save time, not waste it. And besides, even if the kid had malicious intentions, he couldn't be dangerous. He was wiry and scrawny, and he didn't seem to have a strong presence in the Force. "All right," Anakin said. "But I'll have you know, I'm really pressed for time, and if you do anything that slows me down, the deal is off. And also, I'll do the flying, and you won't tell anyone about me." The kid shrugged again. Fair enough. Working with this teenager proved to go quite smoothly. He was competent and useful, knowing how to use all the tools and how all the parts fit together. The two of them got the ship into flying condition in just a few hours, far less than what Anakin had expected. "How old are you, exactly?" Anakin asked as they boarded the ship with R2. 17. "You look younger than that." The kid made a face. "Ugh, I get that a lot." Anakin smiled slightly and fired up the ship's engine. "And what's your name?" The kid leaned back in the copilot's chair and kicked his feet up on the dashboard. "I'm Han Solo, and one day I'll be a pilot for the Empire." The rebels returned to Dantooine in low spirits. Padme felt shaken and numb, and she was sure everyone else did too. As they landed in the hangar of the base, the medical team started to put the injured people on stretchers and move them away. Padme, Mon and Bail watched this sadly, and Mon spoke up. "We should recalculate our numbers soon." "Yes, but not now," Padme murmured. It was bad enough that she knew they had suffered a great loss. It would be even worse to know exactly how great that loss was. And Mon, who was always so precise and organized in everything, nodded in agreement. "It can wait," she whispered. "I think we should all go and get some rest," Bale said, rubbing his forehead. Padme and Mon nodded and they all went separate ways. As Padme had suspected, the child care workers looked quite relieved when she came to pick up Luke, who was a sullen and grumpy mess. "Why were you gone so long?" Luke moaned. "It was hard to be good that whole time." "I know, I'm sorry." Padme crouched down and gave him a gentle hug. "But I'm proud of you for doing your best. Did you get in trouble at all? 2 times I had to go sit in the corner." "You'll do better next time," Padme said with a smile. Luke nodded, and his eyes took on a dreamy, faraway look. "It's just hard," he whispered, "because I get funny feelings sometimes, and no one listens." "Really?" Padme watched his face carefully. "What sort of funny feelings? Like I know people are in danger." "Which people?" "I don't know. Lots of people." Padme was certain that these musings came from the Force. Luke wasn't wrong that many people were in danger lately, and it would make sense that no one would listen to him because they didn't understand the Force. Luke was old enough now that he was beginning to develop an awareness of the Force, and Padme knew she was not properly equipped to help him in this way. He needed a mentor, a GD teacher, like his father or someone similar. The next morning, Padme got permission from Bale and Mon to go alone to Coruscant. It might be dangerous, potentially a bad idea, to go into the capital of the Empire. But she would be careful, she wouldn't take a ship or any other devices from the rebel base. And her friends all agreed that she needed to find Luke a teacher, and Coruscant was the best place to look for clues. It would be nice to get away from here, anyway. Every empty chair in an office, every bandage on someone's arm, was a painful reminder of the disastrous battle. After explaining to Luke what she was doing, Padme drove to the town and rented a ship from a chain that could be found all over the galaxy. Chances were low that the ship would be identified as being from Dantooine. While the ship was in hyperspace, Padme turned on some pretty music and tried to relax. But out of nowhere, a voice startled her. "So we're going to Coruscant?" Padme gasped in alarm and spun to face none other than Luke. "What are you doing here?" she scolded. "I told you, you were supposed to stay at the base." The little boy grinned sheepishly. "I know, but I wanted to stay with you. I want to meet my Force teacher too." Padme sighed, trying to calm herself down. "First of all, when we get back, we're going to have a nice little talk about how we don't stow away in ships, alright? And it's too late for me to turn around and take you back, so I have some important instructions for you." Luke nodded, still smiling. Padme noticed that his eyes shone with excitement, something that was rare back at the rebel base. He must have been so unhappy there. "Here's the thing," she said. "Coruscant is crowded and full of stormtroopers. So I need you to do 3 things. Always hold my hand, be very, very quiet, and don't look at anyone except me. Remember what happened at the toy store? We do not want that to happen on Coruscant." "I know," Luke said softly, looking her in the eye. "I'll be careful." It wasn't long before they arrived on Coruscant. Despite all the noise and excitement of the city, Luke faithfully followed Padme's instructions. He acted like her shadow, peaceful and calm and silent. Meanwhile, Padme was shocked by how much this place had changed. Coruscant had not lost its grandeur, and it was still as well maintained as ever, but its character was different. The people were quiet, as if they were afraid to speak. There weren't so many colorful lights and advertisements. Padme was no GD, but she could practically feel the dark side. The ruins of the GD temple were barely noticeable. Minimized. Surrounded by new buildings built by the Empire. And yet, they had to go there because it was the only chance to find clues. "What's that place?" Luke inquired. He had noticed the old, crumbled building. "The GD temple, or that's what it used to be. Your father used to live there." Fond memories of Anakin and the GD came to her mind, but she shook them away. She and Luke ventured down the street that would lead to the GD temple. But it was blocked off, surrounded by a wall which was guarded by stormtroopers. Padme could hear Luke's breathing increase. "Civilians aren't allowed beyond this point," a stormtrooper snapped at them. Padme's heart pounded, hopefully she hadn't been recognized. Seeing that there was no way into the temple, she and Luke turned away and ducked into an alley, out of their sight. Then a voice, coming from the shadows, spoke up. "Who's there?" Padme jumped and turned to face a hooded figure that was slowly approaching them. Hands shaking, she drew her blaster. "Put that clumsy thing away, it won't be of much use here," the voice said. That's when Padme realized she knew that voice. "Obi-Wan!" she exclaimed. Indeed, as the figure stepped into the light and drew back his hood, it certainly was Obi-Wan Kenobi. He had the same warm smile and wise countenance that Padme remembered. Maybe he had a gray hair or two, and there were some slight creases on his face, but otherwise he hadn't changed much. How good to see you, Padme. What are you doing here, and who is the boy? This is Luke, my son. She smiled and put a hand on Luke's shoulder. Mine and Anakin's. Ah yes, I probably would have gathered that last bit. Obi-Wan chuckled softly. A pleasure to meet you, Luke. Luke shyly hid his face in Padme's skirt. Clearly we have a lot to catch up on, Padme said, but in short, you're the exact person I was hoping to find. Luke is very strong in the Force, and he needs a teacher. Wouldn't Anakin teach him? No, that's the unfortunate thing. Years ago we had to split because the Empire attacked us. Obi-Wan frowned and stroked his beard and thought. But surely, you're out of danger now? Maybe, but we lost contact with each other. Obi-Wan's tone indicated he didn't totally believe it. Anyway, Luke really needs some training. Would you help us? Absolutely. The Jedi Master's smile returned. I have the feeling it would be like training Anakin again, but hopefully I'll do a better job this time. Han Solo was a naive kid, Anakin gathered that much. Clearly, he was unhappy with his circumstances on this nasty planet, so he looked to the greatest source of power in the galaxy to turn his life around. Anakin had done the exact same thing as a 9-year-old on Tatooine. But while the Jedi Order had added purpose to his life and taught him many valuable things, in the end it hadn't amounted to much. The Order had proven to be relatively weak and full of corruption. And if the Jedi Order had been corrupt, the Empire was far worse. Anakin had seen firsthand the way it made the common person struggle to get by, more so than the Republic ever did. Taxes had increased dramatically over the past few years, and what for? To provide the stormtroopers with armor and weapons. Businesses were more tightly regulated than ever before, and many people were losing their homes. Anakin had always hated when a powerful group of people took advantage of those weaker than themselves. You don't know what the Empire is really like, do you? He finally said. Han's dark brown eyes narrowed in suspicion. What, like you know so much about it? More than you do, at least. Why? First of all, you're just a kid still, so I know more than you do about living in the real world. Don't you even go there? Han said indignantly, jumping up to his feet. I've been on my own more than you might think. I may not be technically an adult, but I will be soon, and I'm not some pampered brat, and you're not even that much older than me. What are you, 30? 29? All I'm trying to say is, I've had to provide for more people than just myself. I have a family, and here's the thing. Years ago the Empire forced me away from my wife and son. And just yesterday, they kidnapped my daughter. She's 7 years old, and a couple of stormtroopers put her on a ship and took her to Coruscant. Han sat back down, the expression on his face still hostile. Look, I'm sorry to hear about that and everything, but we have to face the facts. The only plausible explanation I see is that you're a source of trouble for the Empire, so they have to deal with you as a self-preservation mechanism. Is that correct? Unfortunately, it was. But Anakin wouldn't get into specifics. He did not feel that he owed this teenager anything. In the past, he said carefully, I was the sort of person that the Empire might consider a threat. But I have not caused any trouble for them, on any level, for a long time. I'm just trying to say that my family doesn't deserve this from them. They don't need to kidnap children to protect their government. And what does any of this have to do with me? Anakin cringed inwardly at the selfishness of Han's remark, but chose to ignore it. If you join the Empire, you'll have to do things that violate your conscience. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Han leaned back in the chair and laughed coldly. Here's the thing. I really don't have a conscience. That's why I was stuck on that blasted planet Jubilar. I cheated in one of their Sabbac tournaments, and they caught me, so they banished me to that town. They took away my money and my transportation, practically made a slave out of me. And now I don't even care, because I got a right off you. So all I'm trying to say is, your problems are not my problems. Just because you don't like the Empire, it doesn't mean I can't join them. Anakin shook his head. Maybe the kid would learn someday. So, you say you have no conscience. If that's the case, I don't think I can trust you to hold up your end of the deal. Tatooine is coming up pretty soon. I'm pretty tempted to drop you off there and let you fend for your sorry self. Han scowled and jumped up again. No, that wouldn't be fair. I help you fix this stupid ship. But there's another thing you agreed to do. To not tell anyone about me. And considering how I'm going to Coruscant to rescue my daughter, and you have romanticized ideas about the greatness of the Empire, I'm not going to waste my time with you while she needs me. Anakin reached for the controls to pull the ship out of hyperspace, with every intention of stopping to dump Han off on Tatooine. Han's lip twitched, and his face was flushed with anger. He looked as though he would have liked to pick a fight with Anakin right then and there, but he seemed to think better of it. The boy was lanky and awkward, with no real muscle on his frame, and he probably understood that. With a sigh, he sank back down. "I don't need to squeal on the Empire," he muttered. "You'll fail without me helping them. You're just one guy against all of them. You'll be shot down in a split second." "We'll see," Anakin said grimly. Little did the Skywalkers know that all four of them were on Coruscant at once. Anakin dropped Han off far away from the Senate district, quite on purpose. Partly because he didn't want Han to know where he was going, and partly because he wanted the kid to have to figure out his route and transportation himself. Then, Anakin landed a few blocks away from the complex with the Senate and Palpatine's office. A shiver passed down his spine as the presence of the dark side made itself obvious. This place used to feel so familiar and welcoming, and now it felt eerie and strange. Coruscant was now a dark and evil metropolis. "Plus, this is it, R2, Anakin murmured as they stepped out into the middle of the district. As Han had said, this could easily become a massive failure, but Anakin was willing to do whatever it might take. Obi-Wan and Padme deemed it obviously unwise to have a conversation in this alley in Upper Coruscant, so Obi-Wan offered to take them to his home. "Don't be alarmed, but it is in the lower parts," he admitted as Padme and Luke climbed into his speeder. "The area is not the prettiest, but I can assure you, it is quite safe. We needn't worry about bringing Luke there." "No, I'm not worried," Padme agreed. While she wasn't fond of Lower Coruscant, she trusted Obi-Wan's judgment. His house was simple, but clean and well maintained, and he managed to keep it brightly lit, despite the darkness of Lower Coruscant. They let Luke play in the living room while they sat in the kitchen, and Obi-Wan made tea. "Let's start from the beginning," Padme said. "What were you doing immediately after the purge?" Obi-Wan sighed and joined her at the table. "Well, Master Yoda and I were bent on discovering who was behind the attack and warning any survivors to stay away from here. We succeeded in the latter immediately, but discovering who attacked the temple, that was a complicated mystery that led me down many false trails." "What do you mean?" "We could see all the clones on the security footage, and one GD. Or fallen GD, anyway. The person cleverly hid their face from the cameras. All we knew was that it was a young person, tall, wearing dark robes, wielding a blue lightsaber, full of anger and pain. For a long time I suspected it was Anakin." "Obi-Wan?" Padme gasped. "I know that's not true. He was with me in my apartment that whole night." She felt her cheeks heat up as she spoke. It still felt awkward to talk openly about a relationship with Anakin. I know, don't worry. I eventually found out that it was someone else. But back then, when Master Yoda and I didn't know any better, we both knew that Palpatine was behind the entire thing, and we knew that he and Anakin were close friends, and that Anakin was deeply troubled at that time. I didn't want to believe it, Padme, but I had to examine every angle." "How sad," she murmured. "I wish you could have just found us sooner. We would have been able to ease your mind." Obi-Wan nodded and smiled ruefully. "Indeed. You can imagine my relief when, after wandering in the Outer Rim for months, I discovered it to be this female rogue GD who had been seduced by Palpatine into helping him slay all the GD. We had a confrontation. She had plenty of raw power, but no technique, so I brought her down fairly quickly. I couldn't bring myself to kill her, despite all the damage she did. She just seemed lost. I gave her a second chance." "Interesting," Padme murmured. "So what brought you back to Coruscant? It seems rather dangerous." Obi-Wan chuckled and retrieved the tea from the stove. "You'll be amused by this. Throughout my travels in the Outer Rim, I discovered a handful of fellow GD who had survived, and that put me to thinking. If we want any hope of ever reviving the GD Order, even if it never becomes as great as it once was, the few of us that are left need to bond together. I have made it my life's goal these past several years to form an underground network of GD survivors. The thing is, contrary to what the Empire thinks, they did not entirely destroy us. Yes, they put us into a reduced and disorganized state, but there are dozens of us left. Our way of life is not dead yet. I figured, where is a better place to run my network than right here under the nose of the Empire? People always miss the obvious, including them." Padme laughed softly. "I can see where you're coming from. But that still seems rather reckless to me." "Maybe it is. But you know, it's been working. The Empire is not concerned with Coruscant, they know it's securely under their control. They're focusing on conquering the Outer Rim now because they understand how many people there are trying to evade them." Obi-Wan paused, deep in thought, and shook his head. "Enough about me. How have you been keeping yourself busy?" So she told him all about the attack from Sidious's apprentice, about the Rebel Alliance, about Luke, and about the recent battle. It felt so good to pour out her deepest and darkest feelings about that battle to someone who understood all too well. She could tell by the look in Obi-Wan's eyes that he was reliving many tragedies as she spoke. "I can't tell you how many times I've had those exact same thoughts," he said when she was done. "Throughout the Clone Wars, I constantly struggled with doubts whether or not we were doing the right thing. If all the death and destruction was worth it." I know Anakin felt the same way. Padme nodded quietly. This one battle had been so traumatic. When she thought about how many times Anakin had been through that exact same thing, she realized it was little wonder he had come out of it so damaged and disturbed. Especially since, during the Clone Wars, they had all been so young. Changing the subject a bit, Obi-Wan said, "This is quite convenient because I've actually been meaning to go see the Rebel Alliance. I think it would be a great thing for my network and the rebels to be united. Any chance I could catch a ride with you to Dantooine? That would be perfect," Padme exclaimed. "Maybe you could give Luke an introductory lesson on the way there." So they boarded Padme's ship with the intent of heading back to Dantooine. But for the first couple of hours, Luke wanted to go to sleep. It was past midnight at the rebel base, after all. Padme agreed that it was good to let him rest. The ship was quiet for a while. Padme and Obi-Wan were each silent, lost in their own thoughts, and they were startled when Luke started to scream from the back room. They exchanged alarmed glances. "Let me go talk to him," Padme said, getting up to go see what was going on. She found Luke huddled up in a corner, hiding his face in his knees and crying loudly. "What's the matter?" She knelt down and used her finger to wipe the tears from his cheeks. It was a bad dream." Luke looked up at her with red eyes. Padme's stomach knotted with dread. She knew all too well what nightmares had done to Anakin. "What about?" she whispered, trying to hide her nervousness. "There was a girl. She just kept screaming and screaming for help." "Who was she? Have you ever seen her before?" "No, I don't know. Was she a kid, like you? Or was she more of a grown-up?" "A kid, I guess." "What did she look like?" "I don't really remember. I just remember she was in a really dark room, all by herself, on a chair with lots of buttons. She was hurting and scared, and I thought I was stuck there too." "Well, you're not," she reassured him. "It was just a dream. It wasn't real. I felt like it," he mumbled. Padme eventually coaxed him into going back to sleep and went back to the cockpit to tell Obi-Wan about all this. "That is disturbing, considering his natural inclinations towards the Force," Obi-Wan murmured. "If the dream made such an impact on him, it must be important. But why would he dream about someone he doesn't know? Anakin always dreamed about people close to him." "I have no idea." Obi-Wan stared thoughtfully off into the distance. "But we'll keep a close eye on him. The Force must have led me to you at just the right time. I have the feeling that some GD training is exactly what Luke needs." Anakin was so preoccupied walking down the street that he nearly forgot about R2, who was quietly following him. A sudden thought entered his mind, so he took a moment to stop and say something to the droid. "R2, you know you don't have to come with me. Do you know how dangerous this will be?" R2 gave a positive beat, indicating that he did understand. "I might not come out of this alive. You might not either, if you come along. In fact, I think it's better if you stay here. That way, if the worst does happen, you can continue to fight for Leia. Find someone that will help you rescue her." R2 was uncharacteristically silent for several minutes. Then, he gave a sequence of beeps, which Anakin roughly understood to mean, "No. She needs you, not me, and you will need my help. I must go with you." Anakin couldn't argue with a response like that. "All right," he said, "as long as you understand what we're getting into, let's keep going, then." As they walked down the street, Anakin tried to shut out everything around him and concentrate solely on the Force. It was pretty much impossible to feel anything other than darkness, chaos, and fear. The presences of millions of people prevented him from being able to distinguish one person apart from another. This place was a sea of pain, in which Leia was just one drop. But he did feel that the Force was pulling him in a very particular direction. Desperate for a lead of any kind, he followed the disturbance without giving it much thought. "Where are we going?" R2 asked. "No idea." Anakin continued to follow the Force in this manner until they came to a massive building with a sign that read, "The Imperial Academy." Of course. It all made sense. The Empire would want a young child like Leia, so they could put her in training and have influence over her mind early on. Lots of people were freely going in and out of the building, which made sense because it was a public university. Anakin and R2 didn't hesitate before going in. Inside, the building was crowded and complicated, packed with people in hallways and doors. But the Force still seemed to be leading them down a specific path. Anakin found himself being drawn towards a stairway, leading several stories downwards. It was packed with students going up and down. R2 had a hard time maneuvering through the crowd on the stairway and angrily beeped astromech curses at anyone who got in his way. Anakin couldn't help but smile at this. R2, be quiet, some of them might understand you. But as they kept going, the crowd grew thinner and thinner until Anakin and R2 were the only ones there. They eventually came to the bottom of the stairway, which had a door guarded by 2 Imperial officers in their neat gray uniforms. Students aren't allowed beyond this point, one of them snapped. Anakin rolled his eyes. Did they really think he was young enough to be a college-age student in the Imperial Academy? Utilizing Obi-Wan's favorite trick, he concentrated on the Force and imagined a hazy fog forming in the officers' minds. "You will let me and the droid through," he said with a wave of his hand. Thankfully, the expressions on their faces instantly became duller, more docile. "We will let you and the droid through," they said in unison, opening the door. Once inside, the door closed behind them, and they found themselves in a massive, dimly lit room. The opposite wall was hard to see because it was so far away. It was completely silent in here except for a low, guttural laugh echoing off into the distance. "Ah, Anakin," a voice exclaimed. "It's been a long time. I knew you would come." It was the voice of Emperor Palpatine, or, more accurately, of Darth Sidious. As he spoke, he emerged from the shadows, wearing dark robes and smiling grimly. At this, R2 wisely hid himself in the shadows. He seemed to understand that there was little he could do against the most powerful Sith in the galaxy. "Oh, I get it," Anakin snapped, not bothering to hide the bitterness in his voice. "You used Leia as bait to lure me over here so you can kill me, because I'm such a threat to your empire. But let me tell you right now, I won't go down so easily." He reached for his lightsaber and gripped it tightly. Sidious continued to smile and laugh, as if he hadn't even heard Anakin. "My boy, life has always been so simple to you. This or that, right or wrong, black or white. You don't overcomplicate things, and that is to be admired. What do you want?" Anakin said through clenched teeth. "Something very simple. All I want is your undivided attention for a minute or two. If this is about trying to convince me to join you when you took my daughter away. No, listen." Sidious retorted, his expression hardening. "I am willing to overlook many things, Anakin. When you betrayed me, left me to die by Windu's hand, I didn't hold it against you. I never blamed you. Despite what you may think, all I want is to help guide you to a better future." "That's not true," Anakin said bluntly. "First of all, I can see now that I have always been a pawn to you. You were flattering and manipulative, telling me what I wanted to hear. But I've learned a lot since then. It will not work again. You can believe that if you want, but how can you know for sure what I really think, what my true motivations are? I might add that it's quite foolish of you to reject an offer of help from such a person of power and resources as me. I don't want your help because I know that you just want to use me, just like how you used the whole Senate of the Republic. I've seen what your empire has done, and it's evil and corrupt." Sidious sighed in exasperation, as if he were lecturing a stubborn child. "I trust that someday you'll come to your senses, but let me leave you with just this one thing. You are no longer a child or a teenager, so now it's time for you to expand your view of the Force. Really examine it with a critical eye. Evaluate everything that anyone has ever told you about it and decide for yourself whether it's all true. Then maybe you'll understand the full power of the Force." "Look," Anakin said quietly. "I'm not concerned with trying to understand the deeper mysteries of life right now. I just want my daughter back. If you really want to help me, you'll let me go find her. I'm afraid I can't let you do that." Sidious smiled darkly and activated his bright red lightsaber. "If your desire to save her is strong enough, you will be able to overcome me." Anakin, seeing as how he had no other choice, activated his blue blade. His heart pounded as he thought of all those Jedi Masters being slain by Sidious, with very little difficulty on his part. Then Sidious leaped at him, his lightsaber spinning rapidly. And so their duel began. Anakin had no time to be on the offense. Sidious seemed to be everywhere at once, completing his complex sequences of attacks with lots of jumps and acrobatics. It was all Anakin could do to block and dodge it all. He tried to follow the old Jedi saying, "Anticipate, don't react." But Sidious moved so fast, and his patterns were impossible to predict. One time, Anakin managed to create an opening and slash diagonally at Sidious, but the Sith blocked it with ease. "I can't lose," was his only thought. "Leia needs me." Then, Sidious executed a rapid series of powerful slashes, which Anakin blocked sloppily, losing his balance and barely escaping the blows. "I can see that your skills have regressed," Sidious taunted. "But you know you missed this. You would love to regularly use your lightsaber again." "Not if it means fighting for you," Anakin retorted, trying to move into a more stable blocking position. The fight seemed to drag on for hours. Every attack from Sidious became increasingly difficult to block, but the Sith did not seem to be tiring out. Anakin realized, too late, that he had left an opening. Sidious seized on it. It happened so fast that, at first, he didn't fully realize what happened. The pain didn't register at first. He could only watch in shock as Sidious's blade came diagonally across his side, just under his ribs. The next instant, he was on his knees, doubled over and struggling to breathe. His lightsaber was on the floor somewhere. Sidious did not pick it up. Instead, he deactivated his own red blade and chuckled to himself. "You'll learn a valuable lesson from this," Sidious said. "I hope you'll believe me now when I say that not even your love for Leia is strong enough to save her." Throughout the whole flight to Dantooine, Padme was starting to get excited to show Obi-Wan the rebel base. After all, it had been her life's work for years, and she hoped to prove to Obi-Wan that she was capable of making a difference in the galaxy too. But she didn't anticipate what was coming when they arrived at the base. Bail and Mon, upon being notified that Padme had returned, hurried out to the hangar to meet her. She could tell by the looks on their faces that something was wrong. "Is everything all right?" she asked them, climbing out of the ship with Obi-Wan and Luke. Bail and Mon looked surprised to see the former Jedi Master, but they only spared him a hurried greeting before Mon responded to Padme. "I'm afraid the battle had an effect on the morale of our people. Many of them deserted us yesterday, just took their ships and left." Padme closed her eyes, her stomach knotting in dread. "How many people do we have left?" she asked, even though she really didn't want to know. "Between the battle and the people leaving, we lost about 70% of our group." They all fell silent. Padme couldn't meet their eyes. "I shouldn't have gone to Coruscant, I should have stayed here to help you," she said hoarsely. Inspiring and motivating people was her specialty. She probably could have convinced some people to stay. No, don't blame yourself," Bail argued, but his words sounded feeble. Mon and Obi-Wan didn't say anything to agree with him. "I just wanted to get away. I wasn't thinking about the implications." Padme sighed and anxiously brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I could have waited a few days." "Well, we can't change the past. We must move forward," Mon said. The others nodded in agreement. Then Bail spoke up. "So what do we do now?" His voice was upbeat and decisive, indicating that he was undeterred by these challenges. Mon sighed and pulled out her datapad. "That's what we have to figure out." They all got up early the next morning, well before the sun had risen, to discuss a plan to rebuild the Rebel Alliance, if that was even possible. For once, Padme didn't have to worry about Luke, who was getting a day off school to receive a lightsaber lesson from Obi-Wan. The only problem was that Padme felt that she was missing out on a pivotal moment in her son's life. She longed to see the look on his face as he held a lightsaber for the first time. That moment could never be replicated. But the Rebel Alliance needed her now more than ever. The first thing they had to do was estimate the damage done to the base. Padme, Bail and Mon all walked around the base with datapads, making a note every time someone reported a low inventory or whenever they discovered a part blasted off a ship. Then they gave all the numbers to Mon, who spent several minutes making calculations. "It would almost be cheaper to completely rebuild all our inventories from the ground up," Mon said, sighing and resting her forehead on her hand. "A good amount of our supplies were destroyed or damaged in the battle, and as if that's not bad enough, many people who deserted the base took supplies with them. The indecency. I can't blame them, honestly," Padme mused. "They might not have anywhere to go. Their jobs were here with us. But that doesn't make it right for them to steal our things." "I know. So, is there anything else we need to do, now that we've calculated all our losses?" Bail asked. "I don't think so," Mon replied. "We just need a plan now. A real plan. We need to look at this much more critically," Padme said softly. She knew the others wouldn't like what she was about to say. "We need to decide if all this is even worth doing anymore." Bail jumped to his feet and began to pace the room. "Of course it is. Who will stand up to the Empire if we don't? I know, but just think about all this. What have we done to deter the Empire's progress? They ignored all our petitions and obliterated us in our first battle. We haven't saved any lives, we've only led people to their deaths. And now we're pretty much right where we started, and it will take a very long time to get back to where we were. I don't want to just waste time and resources." But who pays the biggest price if we fail? Bale argued. We do. The three of us. This was our idea. People may die for our cause, that's true, but they make that choice for themselves. The common person won't suffer more than they already do if a group of rebels fails to take down the empire. But if we succeed, the empire is hurt, and that helps the people they oppress. We have to remember who we're really doing this for. And I don't know about the two of you, but I'm willing to endure the consequences of our failures in order to have a chance, any chance, of taking down the empire. Padme and Mon exchanged smiles. It was clear that Bale wouldn't give up on the rebel alliance, so how could they? And he was right. They weren't really harming anyone except themselves if they failed. All those people who had died for the alliance had known exactly what they were doing. We can't let our people's deaths be in vain, Padme said slowly. They would want us to keep fighting. Mon nodded. Agreed. Let's go talk to anyone who's left and tell them exactly what you told us, Bale. Convince them to help us rebuild the alliance together. As they walked out of the office, Padme was so lost in her own thoughts that she barely even noticed when Bale's hand brushed lightly against hers. He mumbled a quick apology and stepped aside. Padme didn't say anything about it. What if we do fail though? She asked him. What if we harm people in the process? With the right people on our side, we won't fail. He glanced down at her and smiled. I believe that. You would do well to believe it too.